Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part 4 of my series that I'm calling Buying Guides. I recognize I have a unique opportunity as a gear reviewer to spend time with and to be able to put lenses, cameras through their paces in a way that most of you do not. And so while I'm not going to try to tell you what to buy, I think your opinion matters the most. What I will try to do is to give you just a little bit of insight of what I've gathered, my opinion on some of the options that are out there to help you to have a more informed process in making buying decisions. Previously in the series, we've looked at APS-C from a variety of different systems, and then in the second and third episodes, we looked at both the kind of the lower tier Sony full-frame mirrorless and then the more premium end of things with both cameras and lens options there. And today we're going to be diving into Canon full-frame mirrorless, which I have had a chance to spend time with basically all the camera bodies that have been released and with a good number of the lenses, and have actually owned Canon mirrorless and going all the way back to EF, the original EOS M, but then as soon as the EOS R came out, I was also a part of that process there. And so I'm fairly familiar at this point, and I hope to be able to share with you some of the insights I've gathered over the last few years. First of all, however, a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by talking about camera bodies, and I think that this is really where Canon shines, in that while ironically it was the other way around to begin with. Canon RF lenses were considered to be great, Canon camera bodies were considered to be less great. However, I think that Canon learned a lot of lessons, and in the part of this process, they've been somewhat clever in the way that they've done market differentiation in terms of pricing, to where even their older cameras still, serve a purpose as far as giving options at different price points. And the byproduct of that is that there are basically 5 major camera options, and they go a wide range of price points all the way from $1,000 to $6,000. So a lot of options. So let's break them down. The cheapest of those is the Canon EOS RP at $1,000. It basically was kind of followed the trend of the original camera in the system, the EOS R, in that it took a lot of the components of a DSLR model, including its sensor, and ported that into a mirrorless package. In this case, it inherited the sensor from the EOS 6D Mark II, and so it has a 26 megapixel resolution point. I actually really liked even though it's the smallest of the cameras, I liked the ergonomics, and for a smaller camera, I think that Canon really executed it very well. I found the EOS RP in many ways fun to use, but it does have some pretty serious drawbacks. The first of those is not as significant because you can still get very nice pictures with the RP, but I will note that of all the sensors here, it is the weakest of the sensors in metrics like dynamic range, and it's just not as exceptional a sensor as some of the other options you have available to you. And while the autofocus is quite good for, most typical things, it was really not great in video capture, surprisingly, and the video codecs are really poor. 4K is basically a joke on the EOS RP. It has no in-body image stabilization, and, which maybe is to be expected at this point. But kind of its greatest value is at its low price point, which we could probably get even lower than the MSRP. And so it's a cheap point of entry into full frame, and can be a lot of fun as long as you're practical about what you're going to do with it. If you don't prioritize video and you don't prioritize action, because it doesn't have much of a burst rate at all, and it's really designed for slower moving subjects. So just you bear that in mind. A little bit up the food chain is the original EOS R. And in many ways, the EOS R was a good value to begin with, in that it took most of the components and the goodness of the 5D Mark IV, added in a few other improvements, and sold at a much lower price point. And at this point, that price point has come on down to $1,800. And while this also inherited a sensor that had been previously used, it was a very good 30 megapixel sensor that at the time was considered to be Canon's best sensor. So as a byproduct of that, I think that the EOS R is still capable of producing really fantastic photos. And I still do recommend it for those that have a tighter budget and are looking at a camera to where they're interested more in doing, landscapes or portraits. It's still a very viable option for that and general purpose type use, but again, not great for action. It doesn't have a very high burst rate. It's really, the autofocus is fine. The autofocus is very good, particularly after firmware updates that made IAF more functional. The EOS R had a few ergonomic misses, and particularly the touch bar, which was widely panned and Canon immediately dropped. But beyond that, the build is good. It's got a good sensor. It's got good AF. But again, low burst rate and no in-body image stabilization. And so still a viable camera if you, again, if you're willing to work within some restraints. The next camera in the series is the EOS R6. It has a price point of $2,500. It has the lowest resolution sensor here at only 20 megapixels, which was basically taken from the 1D X series. And so this is more of a budget-oriented sports camera. And it's basically the exact opposite of the EOS R in that sense, in that it can do up to 20 frames per second in electronic mode. It has very good tracking capabilities and is very, very functional. It has in-body image stabilization. It has pretty good video codecs. It's a great fun camera to use, and it would be pretty close to perfect if it had something equivalent to the 30 megapixels of resolution that we find in the EOS R. As it stands, I think that there are going to be some people that find the resolution point too low, and so they feel like spending $2,500 for a camera that only gives 20 megapixels of resolution. I think that's probably the biggest knock against the R6, because otherwise it's really quite a great camera. Now, my favorite camera of the series, for at least my use, is the EOS R5. It is the second most expensive at this point at about $3,900, but it was the first of these cameras to get its own brand new sensor, and it's a 45 megapixel sensor that is awesome. One of Canon's very best, excellent dynamic range, great resolution. It does a lot of things really, really well. And it was also this amazing jack of all trades that in many ways, kind of upped the ante against Sony's Alpha 9 series, in that it had the 20 frames per second burst rate and electronic shutter like that camera, but at a 45 megapixel resolution point instead of 24 megapixels. And so it's a really impressive camera in that it's good at pretty much everything. It has very high video specs. It can do up to 8K 30. It can do up to 4K 120. And the only real knock against it has been that there's some documented overheating issues. For me, I've not had a problem with that because I'm not doing a lot of 8K video at all because I don't really need it. And when I do 4K 120 and even 4K 60, I tend to do those in smaller burst clips for specific purposes. So for, my normal video use, which tends to be more 4K 30, I have no problems at all. I've never had overheating issues with it. However, your mileage may vary. I love the ergonomics of this camera. The touchscreen, an articulating touchscreen is great. It fits great in the hand. It's probably my favorite camera to use of any camera to this point, and does so many things so very, very well. But of course, it is a little more expensive than what some people have to go. And maybe 45 megapixels may seem a little bit on the high end in terms of your needs of resolution, though that's becoming less extreme these days. A great camera, however, and one that I highly recommend. The final and the newest of the series is the EOS R3. It also has another brand new sensor, a 24 megapixel sensor that is designed for extreme sports action. This is a dedicated sports camera. It will do 30 frames per second, and its tracking capabilities is better than anything that I've seen. Even better than my Alpha 1 in that it tracks a little bit better, but even beyond that, the viewfinder and tracking experience is very clean, very visceral, and it keeps you very connected to the action. It's never been easier to capture action than what you can do in the R3. And so it's amazing for that. The 24 megapixel sensor is a very good one, though again, some people may quibble at the resolution point, though it is at the same level, at least for now, with say the Alpha 9 series. But when you're talking about the Sony Alpha 1 and it's 50 megapixels of resolution, yeah, that's another story. The price point on this camera is $6,000. It is what some people would consider a pro-grade design. And what they mean by that is it has an integrated vertical grip. Not everyone prefers that. I'm one of those people, but some people really do. You get better battery life. You have redundant controls when you're shooting in portrait orientation. And it is a really tough, durable body. It's a very high end, very good video specs, not quite at the R5 level in terms of the specifications, but there's also a note of the overheating issues that plagued that camera. For many people, I would say that this is more of a niche camera, the R3, and so not everyone needs it. It's not the best camera for everyone, but if you are someone that needs to do dedicated sports action, it's great for that. And the only place where I would say that the R5, might trump it for capturing some kind of action is if it's more like wildlife oriented, where the deeper cropping capabilities of the higher resolution sensor come into play. At the end of the day, though, I think that you've got a lot of very clearly distinguished niches that are filled by these Canon cameras at this point. Canon's done a great job there, and hopefully that little breakdown helps you to determine what camera works best for you. I'm a little less thrilled on the lens front, which is ironic because, as I said, that's flipped the script from what it was at the beginning, where the EOS R was considered to be a type camera, but the new lenses were great. And Canon has touted a lot about how that it's a newly designed mount with more pins for communication, allows them to do things that they've never done before, like the control ring, for example, and then a whole lot of other things. And initially, the gut reaction was that the new lenses were superior. And even, something as simple as the 24-105 f4L, a staple in Canon's lineup, it was, a little bit smaller, but it was definitely better and one of the best of its kind. And then we saw lenses like the 50mm and 85mm f1.2 that did things at f1.2 that just really hadn't been seen before. And so all was looking very rosy on that front. There was a trend that emerged, however, and that was that Canon's good lenses, the L series lenses, were all very, very expensive, and in many cases priced many hundreds of dollars, in some cases 500 or more, higher than their EF mount equivalents, which were already fairly pricey lenses. And so you've got lenses like that 85mm f1.2 that, while it's great, it's also a $2,800 US lens, and so a very, very expensive investment. And what I have found is that Canon has in some ways kind of painted itself into a corner. So whereas you had a lens like the excellent 16-35mm f4L IS and an EF mount, in the RF mount they've just released an RF 14-35mm f4L IS. That's great, and it's a very high resolution lens, but in the process of going even wider, they also introduced some major amounts of distortion that, and very heavy vignette that have become a negative for a lot of people, and they just feel like those things are too extreme in a lens that costs as much as what it does. And of course, it is hundreds of dollars more expensive than what the EF equivalent was. Byproduct is that EF 16-35 f4L, it still works really well via adapter on your new mirrorless body. So that's what a lot of people are doing. And so in some ways, Canon has priced itself out of a lot of people's budget, in that at one point there was more lenses north of $2,000 than what were under it. And Canon is slowly fleshing that out, but on the other end of the spectrum, some of their cheap lenses tend to be cheaper in some of their aspects than what equivalent lenses on other systems are. A little bit poor autofocus systems. They don't include things like lens hoods and things like that, and no weather sealing. So they kind of cheap out on that end. And the problem is there's this void in between. And that's typically where Sigma and Tamron and the like fill, with very competent zooms and primes that are competitive with the more expensive lenses, but at a more moderate price point. And to this point, we really haven't seen that kind of development, with very few exceptions that I'll get to in just a moment. So as a byproduct, I have found that there are some of these lenses that, because of their price, I expected more out of them as a reviewer than what I saw. And so I'm less thrilled about Canon's lens lineup as I once was. Now, I still consider as good zoom options to be the 24-105, which I think, as a basic general purpose, good quality zoom lens is well worthy of consideration. The 24-70 f2.8 LIS, it does have image stabilization, but again, Canon was kind of adamant in the beginning that stabilization was going to be handled in lens, and they weren't going to do in-body image stabilization, and then they did. And so in some ways, you know, the advantage of having in-body image stabilization, or excuse me, lens stabilization has been mitigated somewhat by the fact that the new cameras have camera stabilization. So, you know, again, an interesting kind of quirk along the way that I don't think that Canon really fully thought through in their execution. But again, the 24-105, the 24-70 f2.8, it's really expensive, but it is a very good lens, but it's not radically better than what the EF version was, even though it's much more expensive. I do really like the 70-200 f4 LIS. It is an extremely compact lens, and I think that it offers up a value, even though it's still expensive, it's a lot less expensive than the f2.8 version. And so if you don't need the 70-200 with an f2.8 aperture, do consider to the 70-200 f4. It's still good enough in many situations, and these cameras are getting so much better at higher ISO values that f4 maybe isn't as much of a penalty as it once was. This 100-500 L series lens is a great telephoto option. It's pricey, and so but it does go, instead of going from 100 to 400 millimeters, it goes up to 500 millimeters, though by the time you get to 500 millimeters, you are 2/3 darker than what the other lens went to. And in that, at 400 millimeters, the EF version was at f5.6. At 500 millimeters, this lens is at f7.1. So, you know, that's a factor, though the kind of counterpoint to that is that if you threw a 1.5 teleconverter on the 100 to 400 to get it up to 540 millimeters, just a little longer than this, you're at a maximum aperture of f8. So, you know, it kind of pays off there. But it's a good lens and worthy of consideration. Some people like the cheap 24-105 STM version, and so that might be a consideration for you as well if you're on a tighter budget. As far as prime lenses, there's not a lot on the budget end to consider. Always a lens like this is important. This is the 50mm f1.8 STM, the nifty 50, and it's not exceptional in anything, but neither is it bad at anything. And so if you want just an inexpensive prime lens, it's worthy of consideration. There's also a new 16mm f2.8, about similar in size, and again, it's similarly fairly competent, though it has a lot of distortion and vignette and really relies on profile corrections to clear that up. So, you know, your feelings on that may vary, and it's priced reasonably at about $300. So that's worthy of consideration. Some people really like the 35mm f1.8 IS lens. It has 1 to 2 macro capabilities. I didn't love it myself, mostly because I did love the EF 35mm f2 IS, which I just thought was really great at so many things. And I didn't think that the rendering was as special from the 35mm f1.8. However, it is effective, and a lot of people do like it. It's compact, it has some macro capabilities, so it might be a lens worthy of consideration for you. The standouts in terms of first-party primes are the 50mm and 85mm f1.2. I actually like the 50mm f1.2 better myself, mostly because I just think it's really special in terms of its rendering, whereas the 85mm is super sharp, but I don't know if it's as special. There is no premium 35mm option at this point, but I will say that the EF version adapts really well and is still an awesome lens. So, as noted, there are very few third-party lenses, and we'll wrap up on that front. There are a few from Samyang that I've got here, and I'm a little hesitant to recommend them too hard because they're very good lenses, and as of today, they're still on sale. But I'm not sure where Samyang is in terms of supporting these lenses, and I noted that when I reviewed the R3 that the 85mm worked just fine, but the 14mm did not, and so it required a firmware update, and I just don't know if Samyang is still doing those firmware updates. I haven't seen it as of yet, and I will note that firmware updating does require you to get an accessory called the Samyang Lens Station, and to be sure to get it in an RF mount. But it's worth investing in that if you do consider these lenses, because there is the chance it will help to keep them future-proof, and also you can tweak some of the behavior. But the 14mm f2.8 is a very competent wide-angle prime, and it's a great value to add, and there's really nothing out there equivalent of it, and it's a native mount lens with weather sealing and a nice build. There are rear filter options out there, so I think that's worthy of consideration. And if you don't have a huge budget, the 85mm f1.4 autofocus lens is a great portrait lens. Again, very nicely built, weather sealed, some good capabilities on it. I really love this lens. It's a little bit warm in its rendering, but outside of that, it's a fantastic portrait lens, and I've taken some amazing photos with it. But again, you know, your mileage may vary on that. Finally, Viltrox has released an even less expensive 85mm f1.8 STM lens that worked quite well. I liked it. Not as well as I did the Samyang, but it's, you know, it is smaller and more compact, and runs at right under $400. So it's definitely worthy of consideration. And I'm hoping that Viltrox is going to push on into this space with a few other options to give us some of those alternatives. At the end of the day, though, this remains, in my opinion, Canon's weak point, in that you've got some really good premium options, you've got some okay inexpensive options. What you don't have is a lot of great moderately priced options, and I still find that some of the EF lenses need to fill that void, and so you may need to consider that as a part of your buying options. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to a playlist for deeper dive reviews into these individual components, so check that out. There's also linkage there to follow myself or Craig on social media, and to check out our new channel, Letthelightin TV, Tech and Video. And then also you can become a patron, get channel merchandise, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. I hope this has helped, and have a great day.